The more people spoke, the more the board members shifted in their seats. It was clear they weren't expecting this much pushback. After several minutes of discussion, the board decided to end the meeting. They said more details would be shared soon and walked out quickly, leaving the room buzzing with conversations. As soon as the board left, people gathered around him. Some thanked him for speaking up. Others admitted they were scared but felt relieved that someone had said what they were thinking. That evening, many neighbors stayed in the clubhouse parking lot. Standing in small groups and discussing what had happened, the quiet unity they had earlier turned into open conversations. People shared their experiences, their worries, and the strange things they had noticed over the past few weeks. For the first time, he realized something important. The board had been acting as if the neighborhood was divided, as if people wouldn't stand together. But now it was clear the community was stronger than the board expected. Over the next few days, things became more intense. The board posted more notices, but this time people questioned every detail. Some neighbors started keeping records of the board's actions. Others looked up rules and legal rights. The older neighbor who had visited him earlier helped explain how things had worked years ago and how much power the homeowners actually had. One morning, he woke up to find a new letter in his mailbox. It wasn't from the board, it was from several neighbors. They had written a simple note asking him to help them organize a meeting of their own. Not an official HOA meeting, but a gathering of homeowners who wanted to protect their rights. He didn't expect something like this, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. They chose to meet in a neighbor's backyard, a large open space where everyone could fit. By the time he arrived, dozens of people were already there. Some brought chairs, others brought notebooks. Everyone looked ready to listen and speak. He didn't act like a leader. He didn't pretend to know all the answers. He simply shared what he had learned from the older neighbor, what he had seen happening, and what he thought they could do next. The mood was hopeful, but serious. People wanted to protect their community, not fight with each other. They agreed that the best step was to request a vote on the new rule. According to the documents the older neighbor showed, major decisions required homeowner approval. That meant the board couldn't just push the rule through without a fair process. The group spent hours discussing the next steps. Some volunteered to help gather signatures. Others offered to talk to neighbors who couldn't attend the meeting. By the time the sun began to set, the plan was clear. Over the next week, the atmosphere in the neighborhood completely changed. Instead of avoiding each other, people worked together. They knocked on doors, explained the situation, and asked for support. Many were shocked to hear what the board was planning. Others said they had felt something strange happening, but didn't know what it was. Slowly, the neighborhood united. When the board finally announced that the new rule would be officially enforced in 2 weeks, the homeowners were ready. That evening, he and several others walked into the HOA office together and handed over a thick stack of signatures. It was more than enough to force a community vote. The board members looked startled. They weren't expecting such a strong response. They accepted the papers, but didn't say much. A week later, the vote was held. Homeowners arrived early, forming a long line outside the clubhouse. Some chatted nervously. Others held their papers tightly. The board sat at the front table again, but this time, their confidence seemed different, less steady. More uncertain, when the votes were counted. The result was clear. The new rule was rejected by a large majority. A wave of relief moved through the room. People smiled, hugged, and shook hands. The board members didn't look pleased. They had no choice except to accept the result. After the meeting, many neighbors gathered outside under the warm evening sky. Some thanked him again. Others apologized for staying quiet for so long. But he didn't take credit. He told them the neighborhood had stood together, and that was what made the difference. Still, the biggest twist of all came the next morning. He received a letter from the HOA, not a warning, not a fine, but an invitation. The board was inviting him to join the next election for an open seat. At first he laughed. It felt strange after everything that had happened. But as he read the letter again, something important crossed his mind. Maybe this was the board's way of trying to show they were willing to listen. Or maybe they had seen how the community trusted him. Either way, it was a chance to help things change for the better. He didn't decide right away. He took a walk around the neighborhood, the same streets where people once avoided contact, but now waved and smiled warmly. He realized something. The community wasn't perfect, but it was worth protecting by the end of the day. He made up his mind. He would join the election, not to fight the board, not to gain control, but to keep the community's voice strong. And that was the real twist. One he never expected when he first came home to a shocking notice on his door. The neighborhood had changed. The board had changed. And he had changed too in the end. What began as a stressful moment became a story of unity, courage, and a community learning to stand together. Hearing all of this made him think back to the incident where the board replaced the flowers in front of his home without asking. At the time, he had assumed it was just the board being pushy. But now, knowing what others had gone through, he wondered if that had been part of a pattern. Maybe the board wanted more control over the neighborhood than anyone realized. As evening came, the neighbors thanked him for listening and quietly went home. He stayed outside for a while, thinking about everything he had just heard. It was clear that something bigger was happening, and he wasn't imagining anything. The tension in the air, the nervous glances, the quiet conversations, it all meant something. Later that night, he sat at his kitchen table and looked again at the notice he had found on his door earlier that week. He studied every line, hoping to find some hidden meaning. It still made no sense, but now it felt like a sign of what was coming next. Just as he was about to put the paper away, he heard a soft knock on his door. When he opened it, an older neighbor stood there, holding a small folder. She looked nervous, constantly glancing behind her. She stepped inside and closed the door gently. Then she opened the folder and showed him several printed documents. They were copies of letters and meeting minutes that she had kept for years. Long before he had moved to the neighborhood, she explained that she had served on the HOA board many years ago. She had seen how the board operated and how decisions were made, but she had also watched things change over time. According to her, the current board was not just strict, they were planning something that could affect the entire community. She pointed to one document in the folder. It was a note from a previous board member, dated almost 10 years ago. It mentioned a discussion about turning part of the neighborhood into a controlled zone, where the board would have increased authority over landscaping, home exteriors, and even certain outdoor activities. The older neighbor said that plan had been rejected back then because it was too extreme. But now, she believed the new board was trying to bring it back quietly. She told him that the board had already tried to gather support from certain homeowners, offering small benefits like fee reductions or approval for special requests. In return, those homeowners were expected to support the new rules. He sat in silence, absorbing everything she said. It was hard to believe that the board would go so far just to gain more control. But the documents she brought looked real. The details matched what he had seen happening around the community before she left. The older neighbor warned him to be careful. She said that the board didn't like being questioned. And anyone who spoke up often received unexpected fines or surprise inspections. She encouraged him to keep an eye on what the board did next and to stay connected with neighbors who trusted him after she left. He felt both relieved and worried. Relieved because he finally had some answers, but worried because the truth was bigger than he expected. He stepped outside for a moment and looked around the neighborhood. The houses were quiet. The streets were empty. Everything looked peaceful. Yet underneath that calm surface, something deeper was happening. The next day, the first sign of trouble appeared. A new notice was posted near the community entrance. It was written in bold letters and said that a mandatory meeting would be held at the clubhouse in 2 days. Attendance was required for all homeowners. The wording of the notice didn't explain anything, but it did mention that the board would discuss important changes that would affect everyone. As people walked past the sign, he saw them reading it with worried expressions. Some whispered to each other. Others just walked away quickly. That evening, he talked to the few neighbors who had met him earlier. They all agreed that the meeting might be the moment when the board would reveal their plan. They didn't know exactly what the changes were. They feared it might give the board more control over their daily lives. He spent the next day preparing himself mentally. He looked over the documents the older neighbor had shown him, trying to understand what the board might be aiming for. He even practiced what he might say during the meeting if given a chance to speak. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, the clubhouse parking lot was full. People walked inside quietly, some carrying their own notices, others whispering nervously. The atmosphere felt thick with tension. He took a seat near the center, close enough to see the board clearly. The board members sat behind a long table at the front of the room, with serious expressions on their faces. The room fell silent as the head of the board stood up. She greeted everyone, but her tone felt rehearsed, almost too calm. Then she began talking about the future of the community, how important it was for everyone to support the upcoming changes. People glanced at each other, confused. She still hadn't explained what the changes were. Finally, she reached into a folder and pulled out a thick document. She held it up and said that the board had voted on a new rule that would give them the authority to make improvements. Without needing homeowner approval, the room went silent. He felt his heart beat faster. This was exactly what the older neighbor had warned him about. As the board member continued explaining, he knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger. And somehow, he was already right in the middle of it. When the board member finished speaking, the whole room stayed quiet for a long moment. It was the kind of silence that came from shock, confusion, and fear all at once. People looked at each other, unsure what to do. The words "make improvements without homeowner approval" echoed in everyone's mind. It didn't sound like a small change. It sounded like something that could change the entire way the neighborhood worked. He sat still, trying to keep calm. He knew this moment was coming, but hearing it said out loud felt heavier than he expected. He looked around and saw the same worry on the faces of the neighbors he had spoken to before. Some of them tightened their grip on the papers in their hands. Others whispered quietly to the person next to them. Finally, someone in the front row stood up and asked the question everyone was thinking. "What kind of improvements are you talking about?" The board member smiled, the kind of smile that didn't feel sincere. She said the changes would focus on keeping the neighborhood uniform and attractive. She didn't give any specific details. She just said the board would have full authority to decide what needed to be changed. People started murmuring again. The lack of detail made them even more uneasy. A few raised their hands, but the board didn't seem very interested in answering questions. Instead, they said the new rule would take effect soon, and homeowners would receive more information later. He felt a sharp worry in his chest. Everything the older neighbor had warned him about was happening right in front of him. And now the board was making it clear they didn't want to be questioned. He waited for the right moment. When the board paused, he stood up slowly. His voice was steady, but everyone could hear the seriousness in it. He asked why the board wanted full control without any input from homeowners. He said decisions that affected everyone should be discussed openly, not decided in secret meetings. For a second, the room seemed to shift. Dozens of people turned toward him, listening closely. The head of the board looked at him with a cold expression. She said the board was acting in the neighborhood's best interest and that too many homeowners were slow to follow the rules. She continued by saying the board needed stronger authority to protect property values. Her answer didn't calm anyone. If anything, it made things worse. He didn't raise his voice or act angry. He simply said that homeowners deserved to be involved in decisions that affected their homes and their lives. His words were simple, but they carried weight. People started nodding. Some even whispered in agreement. A few others stood up and added their concerns. One person said they didn't want the board to change anything on their property without permission. Another said they feared their home would be used as an example for something they didn't agree with. Another pointed out that the board already made mistakes in the past, and giving them more power wouldn't fix anything. On the way to the HOA office, he noticed how quiet the neighborhood was. A few cars were parked along the street, and a couple of dogs barked from behind fences. Otherwise, everything looked peaceful, almost pretending nothing strange was happening. But he knew better now. Something was going on beneath the surface. At the HOA office, he approached the counter and asked to speak with the manager again. The manager looked slightly surprised to see him back so soon, but didn't question it. When he explained that he had proof someone had staged the photo, the manager's expression shifted from polite to serious. He placed the screenshots on the counter. The manager leaned in, studying the images carefully. This doesn't look like the inspector, the manager finally said. The inspector wears a uniform with reflective stripes. This person isn't wearing anything like that, he nodded. Exactly. And look at the object in the picture. It's not mine. Someone placed it there, took pictures, and then took it away before I got home. The manager sat back, clearly troubled. If what you're saying is true, then someone may have filed a false report. I'll forward this to the committee. They'll need to review it. He appreciated the effort, but he could tell from the manager's tone that it would take time he didn't have. The fine deadline was still hanging over him, and he wasn't sure if the decision would be paused while the investigation took place. Walking back to his car, he felt the frustration growing again. He didn't want to be stuck in the middle of a slow system when someone was actively targeting him. He needed to know who did it and why. As he drove through the neighborhood, he noticed an older resident standing near their driveway, trimming a small tree. He stopped the car and called out a greeting. The older resident looked up and smiled warmly. They had lived in the community for a long time and often knew the history behind most neighborhood issues. If anyone had answers, it might be them. They talked for a while, and he carefully mentioned the strange notice he had received. The older resident sighed. "You're not the first one to deal with something like this," they said softly. "People have been getting odd warnings for months. Some say there's someone who likes reporting small things and thing they can find. They walk around late at night sometimes. I've seen them once or twice. Just a shadow moving along the street. Do you know who it might be?" he asked quietly. The resident hesitated. Their eyes scanned the street, making sure no one was near. "There are rumors," they said, "but nothing anyone can prove. And no one wants to accuse the wrong person. This neighborhood can get sensitive." They shook their head lightly. "Just be careful. Not everyone here likes peace as much as they pretend." The warning sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way they were spoken gently, cautiously. As if the resident was afraid of saying the wrong thing, he thanked them and continued his drive home. The more he heard, the more the mystery grew. Someone was causing trouble for multiple homeowners, but no one seemed willing to point fingers. It was like a quiet secret everyone knew but never discussed. Back home, he opened the security footage again. He watched the clip over and over, hoping the repeated viewing would help him see something he'd missed before. But the figure remained a shadow familiar, yet unknown. At one point, he paused the video at the exact moment the person bent down to place the object near the wall. Something caught his eye, a small thin bracelet around the person's wrist. It was barely visible because the sleeve covered most of it, but when the person reached forward, the light from the camera reflected off a tiny metallic surface. He leaned closer to the screen. He had seen that kind of bracelet before. It wasn't expensive or unique. It was distinctive enough to spark a memory. There was someone in the neighborhood who wore a bracelet just like that. Someone who always seemed to be walking around the area, sometimes even at odd hours. Someone who had a habit of pointing out little things that weren't right, like trash cans left out too long or lawns that needed cutting. The thought made his pulse quicken. Could it really be that person? He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the possibility felt too real to ignore. He stood up and walked to the window, looking around the street. Everything was calm. But somewhere behind one of those closed doors, someone knew exactly what they had done. And he was getting closer to figuring it out as the day went on. He decided to walk around the neighborhood, pretending he was just taking a casual stroll. He wanted to observe people, to see if anyone acted strangely or avoided eye contact. He wasn't trying to accuse anyone, but he was hoping for a sign, anything that might connect a real person to the figure in the video. Along the walk, Dee greeted people as usual. Some waved back naturally. Others seemed uneasy, like they had heard something or knew what was going on. A few looked more suspicious than they should have. But he reminded himself not to judge too quickly. Halfway through the walk, he passed by a house where someone was arranging small garden decorations. The person looked up and gave him a quick smile. But something about the way they pulled down their sleeve caught his attention. He slowed his steps slightly, just enough to observe without seeming nosy. The bracelet. The same thin, reflective bracelet he saw in the video. He felt his chest tighten. Maybe it was a coincidence, he thought. Lots of people could own a bracelet like that. But this person also had a habit of paying too. Much attention to other people's homes and small details in the neighborhood, he continued walking, trying not to look back. His mind raced with possibilities, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed real evidence, not just suspicion. When he returned home, he wrote down everything he noticed. The bracelet, the behavior, the late-night movements mentioned by others, the strange way some neighbors had spoken with caution. It was like pieces of a puzzle coming together. Still, he wasn't ready to confront anyone, not yet. Instead, he decided to check the footage again. This time looking for anything else he might have overlooked. He opened the file and watched the clip from the beginning. As the figure walked closer to the camera, he noticed something new, not about the person, but about their surroundings. A faint reflection appeared on a nearby window from a street lamp. The angle of the light was slightly different from the usual pattern. He paused the video and leaned closer. The reflection suggested that the person had approached his house from a direction he didn't expect. Direction that only a few homes shared. It narrowed the possibilities. Even more, he felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief, because he was getting closer to the truth. Fear, because the truth might involve someone he saw almost every day. As evening approached, he sat in silence, staring at the dim glow of the setting sun through the window. He knew he was close to figuring out who had set him up. But he also knew that once he found out, everything in the neighborhood would change. For now. Though he waited patiently, quietly, with eyes wide open. The next morning began with a strange quietness around the neighborhood. It was the kind of quiet that felt heavy, as if the air itself was waiting for something to happen. When he stepped outside, he immediately noticed two board members standing near the corner house, talking in low voices. They went silent the moment they saw him walk by. Instead of greeting him like they usually did, he quickly turned and walked away. He tried to ignore it and kept going with his normal routine. But all through the day, things felt off. The maintenance team, who usually waved or smiled at him, didn't make eye contact. A neighbor he had known for years avoided him by pretending to check his mailbox, even though it was empty. It was strange, and after everything that had already happened with the notice on his door, he couldn't help feeling more concerned. Later that afternoon, he decided to call a small meeting with a few neighbors he trusted. They all gathered in his driveway, staying quiet at first as if they didn't want to be overheard. When he asked what was going on, one of them finally spoke up. She said she had heard rumors that the HOA board was planning something bigger, something that involved more houses than just his. At first, he thought she might be exaggerating. But then another neighbor added that the board had been meeting more frequently, sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, which they never did before. People had noticed them taking pictures of random homes, walking around with clipboards, and even measuring front yards. No one had been told why. He listened carefully, trying to connect the pieces. The previous week's surprise notice had felt like an isolated action, but now it sounded like part of something larger. Maybe the board had a new rule, or maybe they wanted to change the whole look of the community. But why would they keep everything so secret? Why not send out an official update? As the small group talked, he noticed how uneasy everyone looked. Some neighbors said they were scared to speak up because the board had a habit of sending warnings for the smallest things. One person even said they received a fine because their garden hose was not rolled perfectly. Another said they had gotten a warning because the color of their outdoor furniture was slightly different from what the board preferred. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside to take one more look around the house. The sun was still low in the sky, casting soft shadows across the grass. The air was cool, and the street was quiet. If someone had placed something on his property like the picture showed, he felt sure he would have seen at least a trace of it. But again, there was nothing. Not a single sign of anything being moved, placed, or disturbed. He walked slowly around the house again, checking every corner. He even crouched down to look under the small table in his backyard, though he knew it was pointless. Everything was exactly as it had always been. He let out a breath, long and tired. "I'm going back to the HOA office," he muttered to himself. There has to be more information. Inside his car, he sat for a moment before starting the engine. He looked at the houses around him. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, as if it had no idea about the strange situation he was dealing with. But he couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there knew something he didn't. When he reached the HOA office, he waited for the manager again. This time the manager seemed a little more cautious, as if they sensed he wasn't going to let the issue go easily. He explained again that the photos didn't make sense. He pointed out the differences in the picture, the strange angles, the odd timing. The manager listened politely but gave the same answer as before. The photos were submitted by the inspector. They are marked with your address. He felt frustration rising inside him. But the picture doesn't match. I know my property. I checked every inch of it twice. There's nothing there. The manager pursed their lips. I understand your concern. I can send a message to the inspector to verify it, but it may take some time. He nodded, though he didn't like the idea of waiting. Time was the one thing he didn't have. The notice said he had only 48 hours. Once the fine was issued, it would be hard to reverse. On the way home, he stopped by the small community park, thinking he might clear his head. The park was empty, the benches lined neatly along the path. He sat down and stared at the ground. He felt tired, not from the lack of sleep, but from the confusion and the feeling that something was happening behind his back. After a few minutes, he got up and walked toward the neighborhood entrance. That's when he ran into one of the neighbors he had spoken to the day before. The neighbor gave him a half smile and said, "Everything okay? You looked stressed yesterday." He explained the notice again, leaving out the more unsettling details. The neighbor listened carefully and then nodded, lowering their voice. There's been talk. Some people in the neighborhood have been getting weird warnings lately, warnings that don't make sense. People getting notices for things that never happened, or for things the inspector never actually checked." He blinked in surprise. "Seriously?" The neighbor nodded again. "People think someone is reporting things anonymously. Someone who likes stirring trouble." He frowned. "But why would someone do that? What's the point?" The neighbor shrugged. "Control, maybe. Or they're bored. Or maybe they just like seeing people stressed out. No one knows for sure." The neighbor walked away, leaving him with even more questions than before. He continued his walk, thinking carefully about everything the neighbor had said. If others were getting strange notices too, maybe his situation wasn't an accident. Maybe someone was targeting people in the community. The idea made him uncomfortable. Later that afternoon, he decided to check something he hadn't looked at yet, his security camera footage. He didn't expect to find anything unusual, but it was worth checking. He set his laptop on the table and pulled up the footage from the days he had been away. Most of it showed nothing but quiet nights, empty streets, and the soft movement of trees in the wind. But then, around 2:30 in the morning, on one of the nights he wasn't home, something caught his attention. A figure appeared at the edge of the screen. The person walked slowly toward the side of his house. Moving carefully as if they didn't want to be seen, he leaned closer to the screen. The figure had a hood pulled up and moved quietly. The person reached into their pocket and pulled out something small. They placed it near the base of the wall, the exact area the photo in the HOA office had shown. Then the person stepped back, pulled out a phone or camera, and snapped a few pictures. His heart pounded as he watched. The figure stayed only a few seconds before slipping away into the shadows. He replayed the clip again and again. Each time he watched, he noticed something new, a certain movement in the way the person walked. The shape of their shoulders, the small hesitation before taking the picture. The figure looked strangely familiar. Not enough to be sure, but enough to stir something in the back of his mind. He paused the video, staring at the frozen image of the shadowy person. Who would do something like this? Who would come onto his property in the middle of the night and stage a fake violation? He printed a few screenshots from the video, even though they were a bit blurry. Then he saved the clips separately. If he needed proof later, he wanted to be ready. As evening approached, he decided to talk to another neighbor, who always seemed aware of everything happening in the community. This neighbor was known for keeping an eye on things and usually had information nobody else did. When he explained what he had found, the neighbor's face changed slightly, not surprised, but cautious. "I've heard rumors about someone walking around late at night," the neighbor admitted quietly. "People have mentioned seeing a shape or movement around their property. Some thought it was an animal. But now, maybe it wasn't." He swallowed hard. The pieces were slowly coming together, but not in a comforting way. It seemed like there was someone in the neighborhood who enjoyed creating problems for others, someone who felt powerful when people were stressed. He went home feeling more alert than before. He locked all the doors, checked the windows, and even walked outside once more just to make sure everything was as it should be. The street was calm, but there was a strange heaviness in the air. Inside, he sat on the couch with the printed screenshots beside him. He stared at them, trying to identify the figure. Every now and then, he would pick up one of the papers, tilt it toward the light, and study it again. The small details bothered him, the way the person slightly leaned to one side while standing, the awkward way they held the phone, the unusual bend in their elbow. He tried to recall everyone he knew in the neighborhood. Who walked like that? Who had that build? Who had a reason to sneak around in the middle of the night? He spent hours thinking, but no clear answer came. Only suspicion. As night fell, he felt something shift inside him. The mystery was no longer just an annoyance. It felt personal. Someone had stepped onto his property, staged something, and then made sure he would suffer for it. He wasn't just dealing with a mistake anymore. He was dealing with someone who wanted to cause trouble. He turned off the lights and sat quietly, listening to the sounds of the night outside. Every small noise made him alert. He never thought that a simple notice from the HOA would turn into something like this. But deep in his mind, he understood one thing clearly. Now, this wasn't just an issue with the HOA. This was a person. Someone close. Someone who had been watching. He didn't know who yet, but he was going to find out. The night felt heavier than usual, as if the air around him carried the weight of the questions he could not answer. He sat at the edge of his bed long after midnight, thinking about the shadowy figure in the video. Every time he closed his eyes, the same image came back, the person placing something by the side of his house and taking pictures like they were preparing evidence for a case he did not know he was part of. He tried to sleep, but it was impossible. His mind kept replaying every detail. The slight hesitation before the person took the picture, the way they stood, almost leaning to one side, the quick escape. Something in their movements felt familiar, but the memory was just out of reach. It's like a word stuck on the tip of his tongue. When the morning finally arrived, he felt tired but more determined than ever. He knew he couldn't let this go. Someone had stepped onto his property. Someone had placed something there in the dark and tried to blame him for it. It wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore, it was intentional. He walked to the kitchen, made himself a simple cup of tea, and stared at the steam rising slowly. The quietness of the house didn't comfort him. Instead, it made him feel alone with the situation. He picked up the screenshots from the video that he had printed the day before and spread them out on the table. He studied them again. The images were blurry, but the outline of the figure was clear enough to show the body shape and some small details like the loose sleeves of their hoodie and the way one foot turned slightly outward when they walked. He didn't want to accuse anyone without proof, but it was impossible not to think about the neighbors who had always seemed too interested in other people's lives. After a few minutes of staring at the photos, he decided to talk to the HOA again. He didn't want to wait for the inspector to respond. He wanted answers today. He grabbed the papers, slipped them into a folder, and headed toward his car. The day started in an ordinary way, with nothing unusual to warn him about the strange turn his life was about to take. He had just returned from a short work trip, the kind that left him tired but grateful to be back in his own home. The ride from the airport was quiet. He watched the familiar streets slide past the window like pieces of a puzzle coming back together. Everything looked the same, and that gave him a sense of calm. He had no idea that a simple piece of paper on his front door was about to ruin that calm. When he pulled into his driveway, he noticed something bright stuck on his door. At first, he thought it might be a package notice, or maybe a flyer someone had placed there. The color of the paper stood out from far away, almost like it was trying to call him before he even stepped out of the car. He frowned a little, but didn't think too much of it. Things like that happened all the time in his neighborhood. He took a deep breath, grabbed his bag, and walked toward the front door. The paper moved slightly in the wind as if it were alive. When he got closer, he saw the bold letters printed across the top. It was from the HOA. His stomach tightened. No one liked getting letters from the HOA, especially not ones taped to the door for everyone to see. There was something embarrassing about it, like a public scolding. He carefully pulled the paper free and stepped inside before reading it. He placed his bag on the floor, closed the door behind him, and then looked down at the letter. It was a notice, not a friendly reminder, not a simple update. It was a final warning. His eyebrows drew together as he read it again slowly, thinking maybe he had misunderstood. The letter claimed he had violated an HOA rule and had only 48 hours to fix the issue, or face a heavy fine. But the strange part was that the notice didn't fully explain what the violation was. It only mentioned an unauthorized exterior modification. He blinked. Exterior modification. He hadn't changed anything on his property. In fact, he hadn't even been home. He walked around his living room, reading the letter again and again, as if the words would reshape themselves into something reasonable. They didn't. Frustration settled in his chest. He put down the letter on the kitchen counter and went outside to check for himself. The air was still warm from the afternoon sun, and the street looked peaceful. Birds hopped around the neighbor's yard like everything was normal. He walked along the side of his house, checking the walls, the ground, the windows, anything that might look different or out of place. But everything looked the same as before. No new paint. No strange objects. No damage. Nothing that could possibly count as a violation. He crouched down to look near the base of the wall, checking for anything small he might have missed. Still nothing. He let out a slow sigh. The whole thing made no sense. He felt both irritated and a little nervous. Getting a warning like this, without understanding the reason, felt like someone was pointing a finger at him in the dark. He stood and walked toward the front yard. A few neighbors were outside, watering plants or carrying groceries. One of them gave him a small nod, and he returned the gesture. He wondered if they had seen the letter taped to his door earlier. The thought made him feel uneasy, like people might be whispering about him. It was ridiculous, he told himself, but the feeling lingered. He checked the front of the house carefully. He inspected the doorframe, the mailbox, the small flower bed, where he grew a few simple plants. Everything looked exactly how he left it before his trip. He almost laughed from exhaustion and confusion. How was he supposed to fix a problem he couldn't even find? He went back inside, sat at the kitchen table, and read the letter once more. This time he noticed something small at the bottom, a timestamp and a note saying photos of the violation were on file. That stopped him. Photos. If there were photos, then surely he could figure out what this was all about. But the office was closed for the evening. He would have to wait until the next morning. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The quietness of the house felt heavier than usual. It was the kind of silence that made thoughts louder. He wondered if it was some kind of mistake. Maybe they put the wrong address on the form. Maybe the letter wasn't even meant for him. That idea gave him a little comfort, but only for a moment. As night settled in, he made himself something simple to eat. But even while eating, his mind kept drifting back to the letter. It sat on the counter like it was waiting for him to pick it up again. He forced himself to ignore it and turned on the TV, hoping for a distraction. The sound filled the room, but his mind still wandered. By the time he went to bed, he felt anxious in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the letter. It was the feeling of being accused of something he didn't do. A feeling of being watched or judged unfairly. He didn't like it at all. He lay awake for a long time thinking about the situation, about how something so small could stir so much. Eventually, sleep came, but it didn't come easily. The next morning, he woke up early and got ready to visit the HOA office. Before leaving, he checked the house once more, walking around slowly, almost hoping something would jump out and make the letter make sense. But like yesterday, everything was normal, untouched, unchanged. He got in his car and drove to the community building. The sun was rising in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets. He noticed how quiet the neighborhood was. For a moment, He wondered if anyone else had received such strange notices before, or if he was the only one. When he arrived at the office, he walked inside and waited at the counter. The manager, a calm-looking person with a stiff posture, greeted him with a polite smile. He explained the reason for his visit and handed them the letter. The manager checked the system and nodded. "Yes, we have photos showing the violation," they said. One moment. He clicked around on their computer before turning the screen slightly so he could see. His eyes locked onto the images. At first glance, the photo appeared to show the side of his house, but something felt off. The angle was unusual, as if someone had leaned over or climbed onto something just to take the picture. The lighting was strange too, like it was taken at a very odd hour. And the object in the photo, the so-called violation, was something he had never seen before. It looked like a small structure placed near the wall, something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there, but he knew it wasn't his. He had never seen it in his life. He leaned closer, studying every detail. The more he looked, the more confused he became. "This isn't mine," he finally said. "I don't have anything like that on my property. I checked everything yesterday. There's nothing there." The manager looked at the photo again. "The address marked on the inspection is yours," they replied. The photo was submitted by the community inspector. "But this isn't my house," he insisted. "The wall looks similar, yes, but look at that corner. That's not how my siding looks. And that plant there, I've never had anything like that in my yard." The manager hesitated. It could be a lighting difference, they suggested. But even they didn't sound convinced. He left the office feeling even more unsettled than before. Something wasn't right. Someone must have made a mistake, or worse, someone was doing this on purpose. The idea made his stomach twist. He drove home slowly, thinking through everything. Who would take a picture like that? Why would someone claim he had something on his property that he clearly didn't? What was the point of it? He tried to brush it off as a simple error, but the thought didn't sit well with him. Later in the day, he talked to a few neighbors casually. He didn't tell them everything, just mentioned that he had gotten a strange notice. One neighbor raised an eyebrow and said quietly, "You're not the only one getting weird complaints." Lately, another neighbor nodded and whispered something about someone in the neighborhood who liked reporting people for the smallest things. Their tone made it clear everyone knew someone was stirring trouble, but no one wanted to say the name out loud. He walked home with a heavy feeling in his chest. He didn't want drama. He didn't want conflict. He only wanted to understand what was happening. But now, with half-whispered comments and strange photos in the system, he felt something deeper for Mia, mystery he hadn't asked for. That night, he sat on his couch, staring at the walls of his home. A place that once felt safe, now felt uncertain. He had no idea that this was only the beginning, and that the truth waiting for him was far stranger than anything he imagined. He woke up the next morning with the same uneasy feeling he had gone to sleep with. The notice from the HOA still sat on the kitchen counter. Just seeing the edge of the paper made his stomach twist a little. He tried to brush off the feeling, telling himself he would figure everything out today. But deep down, he knew something about the situation felt strange. Almost like a puzzle, where someone had removed a few important pieces. After getting ready, he made a quick breakfast, though he barely tasted it. His mind kept going back to the photos he had seen in the HOA office. No matter how much he tried to make sense of them, nothing added up. The object in the picture wasn't his. The background didn't match his property, and even the plants looked different. It was like someone had taken a photo of a place that looked similar to his home, just enough to cause confusion.